Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday here on September the 27th. So, soybean harvest got a great start this past week and then hit a screeching halt when the rains came in. It was a nice opportunity for a lot of folks to get things rolling, test out the harvest equipment, and get a look at what yields may look like for 2024. Now, these rains were also really nice to get some of that early planted wheat germinated. Now, speaking of soybean yields, those early planted fields are pushing out some very impressive yields this year. One farmer I spoke to in mid-Michigan said that he was watching his yield monitor hit 90, 100, 110 bushels per acre, where it was running good, but getting just a big goose egg in those drowned out places where the spring was just too wet. Now, this was giving him some field averages in the mid 70s, and he was really pretty happy with his variety selection. Now, while I was in West Michigan, guys were also talking some big yields. They had some field strips weighing in at over 100 bushels per acre and some field averages in the 90s. Now, the problem is that boy, a lot of those guys also had some field averages in the 40s where white mold just continues to be a problem. Now, when walking some later mid-May to mid-June planted soybeans, I fear our yields may moderate across the state. Walking soybean plots, I'm seeing what looks like a yield advantage to those varieties that finished the majority of their yield early. So, some of the fuller season varieties, especially those planted late, they may have suffered from this past month of drier than normal conditions. Both, top pod development and bean size development tend to get hurt when we try to complete our yield equation with the heat and not enough rains, especially during that R6 or full seed growth stage. But the combines will tell the full truth shortly, and the only thing I know for sure is that yields will vary greatly across the state, depending on your individual weather pattern, soil types, management, and even your disease severity. Now, before we get any deeper into this week's podcast, let's take a moment to just see how far ahead we are this week in heat unit accumulation. For the full details, let's check in with MSU's Enviro weather site. Now, this week's data shows in the East Lansing center of the state here, 2,582 heat units since the 1st of May, putting us 77 heat units above the 5-year average. Jumping over to West Michigan, Allegan County, 2,661 heat units, 65 above the 5-year average. Down southeast, that Deerfield, Blissfield area, 2,805 heat units, or 92 above the 5-year average. Jumping up into the Thumb, Sandusky area, 2,520 heat units, 112 above the 5-year average. And then wrapping up in north central Michigan, that Ithaca area, 2,750 or 124 heat units above the 5-year average. Now, this puts us 4 to 8 days ahead of that 5-year average and now about 3 weeks ahead of last year. Interesting enough, I had some questions this week about how our growing degree day accumulation would look if we planted our corn a little earlier, like April 15th, or if we got delayed to May 15th. So I dug a little deeper. I used just the East Lansing location data, and I found that you would be only 2 days ahead of the 5-year average if you planted May 15th this year, versus 5 days ahead if you planted May 1st. But if you planted way early, like April 15th, you would be 8 days ahead of the 5-year average. It was also interesting to see that planting 4 weeks earlier this spring would have equated to being about 2 weeks ahead near harvest. So I figured this by taking the total heat units from April 15th to May 15th and then divided that by the 15 heat units per day we will accumulate in a week like the one ahead. So it is nice to get planted early, but at least this year we only lost 2 weeks of crop development at harvest versus the 4 weeks we might have been delayed at planting. So now for this weekend in my travels, I've had a nice opportunity to walk a lot of our plots and do some product training with some of our resellers. The biggest question I'm getting is around estimating yields. Now, I know that we have reviewed the corn yield formula previously on this podcast, and for corn, it is the usual counting of the number of rows around times the number of kernels long times the number of harvestable ears, and then dividing this total by 90 or less, depending on the number of kernels it takes of that particular hybrid to make a bushel of corn. So, for those that have talked to me about this formula in person before, you probably know that I'm not a huge fan of what this number tells us simply because there are just so many variables that make up yield that just can't be easily taken into consideration with this formula. It doesn't consider kernel depth. It doesn't consider that I can have the same diameter ear with wide kernels, let's say that only make up a 14 row around cob, and compare that to a 20 row around cob that has these just little slivers of kernels. The math would obviously favor the 20 row around hybrid, but that isn't always the case. So then there's always the cob diameter to think about because, some hybrids look really girthy, but you break open that ear and it's all cob and just little short kernels. So we're left with playing around with that bottom number to the equation to kind of improve the accuracy of that formula. But at best, we're then guessing on what that number should really be, and accuracy then kind of goes out the window. So therefore, at the end of the day, the real estimation of yield will be with the combine and the farm or elevator scales. Now, the good news is that in my walks of plots this past week, I truly believe that we're looking at an above average corn crop across a good portion of the state. Now, maybe the exception being in that more droughty southeast part of Michigan, but tip fill is excellent. Kernel depth looks really good, and we are at or close to black layer on a majority of the 2024 corn crop. On the watch out side of the equation, I am still seeing pockets of tar spot, and they're getting worse, and lots of those V-shaped lesions that indicate to me a true shortage of nitrogen in those plants. This can all lead to stalk cannibalization and therefore stalk lodging with the windstorms we have, particularly in the fall season. Now, if you haven't already started doing it, please make some time to walk your cornfields and let's do some push tests. So what we need to do is we need to walk 10 plants in a row, push those at about a 45-degree angle over and just see how many break. This does make for some pretty easy math when figuring your percentage of stalks at risk of lodging with that next wind event. Now be sure to do this in multiple locations in each of your fields because standability will vary by soil type, by planting date, and by hybrid. So this will also help in making the decisions of what fields to schedule first for harvest, and also maybe encourage you to harvest at a little higher percentage moisture in order to get a better yield and a better return on investment per acre at the end of the season. As for estimating soybean yields, well, good luck. It is definitely a totality of the number of beans harvested combined with the size of each bean, and both really matter greatly when determining that yield. As I've said earlier, it just seems to be proving itself true again this year. Early planted soybeans are high yielding soybeans. Yes, there is a frost risk, but there just seems to be a consistent, nice benefit too. While we are on the topic of beans, and I'm looking at the 10-day forecast of wet, dry, I really continue to worry about making our soybean pods just more fragile. And I'm expecting to see more shattering, both in the field and as we're trying to get them into the combine. So let's get those beans harvested as soon as possible. As we've seen for way too many years in the past, once we get into this pattern of fall moisture, it gets harder and harder to find those good soybean harvest days. Now, on a final note, I did get a photo of an ear of corn from the southeast part of the state of Michigan that was just covered in green mold a few days ago. Now, luckily, it was not one of our genetics, but I still feel bad for the farmer there. So what we've got going on is this is called, it's a mold, it's called trichoderma ear rot, and it's caused by a fungus that it takes hold when a plant is under some pretty severe stress, kind of like the drought stress we've seen in southeast Michigan this late summer, and it's primarily found on scattered plants in a field, and it's associated, though, with injury to that developing ear. So in this case, the ears were showing that green mold, and you looked at them a little closer, and what you could see is a fair amount of bird damage on the tips of those ears. And that, of course, just allowed the fungus to enter that ear and take hold. Now, the good news is this type of fungus, it's not associated with mycotoxin. So, it just needs to be dried completely before we stick it in storage. So with that, I hope you had a great week and plans for an even better week ahead. This is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest Michigan agronomist, with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday. Have a great weekend.